Vladimir Putin spent 20 years building what may have been the most rational geopolitical strategy of the 21st century. 20 years, 2 decades of patient, disciplined, ruthlessly logical construction, piece by piece, relationship by relationship, pipeline by pipeline, treaty by treaty. The architecture was elegant. Bind Europe to Russian energy so deeply, so structurally, so completely that sanctioning Russia would mean freezing in the dark. Keep NATO focused on its western flank, pinned down by political divisions, by burden-sharing arguments, by the comfortable assumption that the post-Cold War peace was permanent. And across the Pacific, build deep economic bridges with Asia's technological powerhouses, South Korea, Japan, the semiconductor giants, the precision manufacturing ecosystems that Russian industry desperately needed and couldn't replicate domestically. It was elegant. It was disciplined, and it worked. European gas dependency gave Moscow a veto over Western sanctions policy. NATO expansion was slow, cautious, politically constrained. Asian trade partnerships, particularly with Seoul, provided Russia with the high-end consumer goods and industrial components that kept Russian factories running and Russian living standards tolerable. 20 years of construction, 20 years of positioning, 20 years of building a strategic framework that made Russia the indispensable partner nobody could afford to alienate. And then Putin destroyed it, personally, deliberately, in a single decision that unraveled every thread he had spent 2 decades weaving. Because right now, at this very moment, South Korea, one of Asia's most powerful economies, home to some of the most advanced weapons factories on Earth, a nation that produces more artillery shells per year than the United States, is on the verge of a decision that could fundamentally alter the course of the war in Ukraine. Not by sending a single soldier, not by firing a single shot, by joining a financial mechanism so precise, so strategically lethal that Moscow is already threatening retaliation. And what makes this truly devastating for Putin is the supreme irony at its core. He didn't just lose South Korea, he gave South Korea to his enemies. Through his own choices, his own alliances, his own decisions. He signed a military pact with Kim Jong-un. He deployed 14,000 North Korean soldiers to fight in Ukraine. He turned the Korean Peninsula's most dangerous threat into his own ally. And in doing so, he convinced Seoul, a capital that had spent decades carefully balancing its relationships, that neutrality was no longer possible. Putin's alliance with North Korea was supposed to solve a manpower problem in Ukraine. Instead, it activated an industrial powerhouse that can produce twice as many artillery shells as the United States. And that industrial powerhouse is about to start funding the weapons that kill Russian soldiers. This is not a diplomatic footnote. This is a tectonic shift in the global balance of power. And if you understand what's actually happening, if you understand the chain of cause and effect, the strategic logic, the industrial math, the geopolitical dominoes, you understand that this is the moment when Putin's 20-year strategy didn't just fail, it boomeranged. Subscribe to join the community. Leave a comment so we can keep the conversation going. And share this video because what's unfolding right now between Seoul, NATO, and Moscow is one of the most consequential strategic realignments of the 21st century. And it's happening because the man who built the most careful geopolitical architecture of his generation couldn't resist the urge to destroy it himself. Let me start at the beginning. Because to understand why South Korea's next move matters so much, you have to understand what Putin built. And then you have to understand how he personally, methodically, and almost systematically dismantled every piece of it. For 2 decades, Russia's Eurasian strategy was built on simple and ruthless logic. 3 pillars, each one designed to protect Russia from the vulnerability that destroyed the Soviet Union: economic isolation. Pillar 1. European energy dependency. Russia supplied roughly 40% of Europe's natural gas, not through spot market transactions that could be redirected, through pipelines. Physical infrastructure that locked European buyers into Russian supply for decades. Nord Stream 1 and 2, Turk Stream, the Yamal-Europe pipeline, each one a chain binding a European economy to Russian energy. Each one making sanctions against Russia an act of economic self-harm for the sanctioning country. The logic was brilliant. You can't sanction your heating bill. You can't embargo the electricity that powers your hospitals. Every European leader who considered punishing Russia for Crimea, for Salisbury, for election interference had to weigh the cost of punishment against the cost of cold homes and closed factories. Most of them chose to write strongly worded letters. Pillar 2, NATO containment. Keep the alliance focused inward. Exploit divisions between members who spend on defense and members who don't. Encourage the perception that NATO is obsolete, that the real threats are terrorism and immigration, not great power competition. Every year NATO spent arguing about burden sharing was a year NATO wasn't building the force structure needed to counter Russian power projection. Pillar 3, Asian technology partnerships. This was the quiet pillar, the one that didn't make headlines, but it was arguably the most important. Russia's industrial base, inherited from the Soviet Union, was vast but aging. Russian factories could produce steel and aluminum and crude weapon systems in bulk. But the precision manufacturing, the semiconductors, the machine tools, the automotive components, the consumer electronics, Russia couldn't produce those at competitive quality. It needed partners. South Korea was perfect. The world's 12th largest economy, home to Samsung, the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer, home to Hyundai, a global automotive and shipbuilding giant, home to a defense industrial base that produces weapon systems matching or exceeding Western quality at a fraction of the cost. The relationship was never warm. It didn't need to be. It was transactional. Russian energy and raw materials flowed to Korean industry. Korean technology and consumer goods flowed back. Russian diplomatic influence in Pyongyang, limited but real, gave Seoul a channel to manage its most dangerous neighbor. Both sides benefited. Both sides understood the arrangement. Both sides maintained it. For Russia, South Korean trade was worth approximately $10 billion annually by 2021. Hyundai operated a major factory in St. Petersburg. Samsung and LG had significant market presence. South Korean semiconductors and precision components flowed into Russian industrial supply chains, not dramatically, not visibly, but structurally, in ways that Russian industry had come to depend on without quite acknowledging the dependency. For South Korea, the relationship provided market access, diplomatic utility regarding North Korea, and the kind of quiet stability that middle powers value above all else. Seoul walked a careful line, critical of Russian aggression in public, maintaining the economic relationship in private. 20 years, 3 pillars, each one supporting the others, each one making Russia harder to isolate, each one reducing the risk that the West could ever apply the kind of comprehensive pressure that might actually threaten the regime. It was the most rational geopolitical strategy of the 21st century. And then, on February 24th, 2022, Putin drove a tank through it. The moment Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine, every pillar cracked. European energy dependency, which was supposed to make sanctions politically impossible, instead made the sanctions personal. European citizens were furious, not at Russia for invading, not at Ukraine for resisting, at their own governments for allowing the dependency that now left them vulnerable. The political dynamic flipped overnight. Instead of energy dependency preventing sanctions, it fueled the demand for them. European leaders who might have hesitated were swept forward by public opinion that viewed the dependency as a betrayal of values and a strategic failure. Germany froze Nord Stream 2. Europe accelerated its energy diversification. Within 2 years, Russian gas's share of European supply dropped from 40% to under 15%. The pipelines that Putin spent decades building became stranded assets. The leverage they were supposed to provide evaporated. NATO containment, which was supposed to keep the alliance divided and inward-looking, reversed completely. Finland and Sweden joined. Defense spending surged across the alliance. The United States deployed additional forces to Eastern Europe. The alliance that Putin assumed was too weak and too divided to respond became the most unified, most well-funded, most operationally active it had been since the Cold War. And the Asian technology partnerships, the quiet pillar, the one that was supposed to be immune to Western political dynamics, that pillar held the longest. Because the Asian partners had different calculations, different priorities, different political pressures. South Korea imposed export controls after the invasion. 42 strategic product categories restricted, but the economic relationship wasn't fully severed. Both sides had too much to lose. Seoul still needed to manage the North Korea channel. Moscow still needed South Korean technology. The quiet relationship continued, diminished but not dead, until Putin killed it himself. The chain of events that destroyed Russia's relationship with South Korea is a case study in strategic self-destruction. Each step was taken by Putin. Each step made the next one inevitable, and each step pushed Seoul closer to exactly the alignment Moscow most feared. Step 1, September 2023. Putin met Kim Jong-un at Russia's Vostochny Cosmodrome. The images were carefully staged. Two leaders on Russian soil, shaking hands, walking through space launch facilities. The visual message was clear. Russia and North Korea are partners, technological partners, military partners. The substantive message was even clearer. According to South Korean Defense Intelligence Agency data cited by multiple outlets, more than 33,000 containers of military equipment were subsequently transferred from North Korea to Russia, including an estimated 1.5 million artillery shells shipped through Rajin port. Seoul watched and raised its warning level, because every artillery shell flowing from Pyongyang to Moscow was a signal. Russia was willing to deepen its relationship with South Korea's most dangerous enemy to sustain its war in Ukraine. The careful balance, Russia maintaining credibility with both Koreas simultaneously, was being abandoned. Putin was choosing Pyongyang over Seoul, and Seoul was taking note. Step 2, June 2024. Putin flew to Pyongyang, and what happened there was not a visit. It was a commitment. Putin and Kim signed a mutual defense pact, a formal treaty providing for military assistance if either side came under attack. Read that carefully. If either side came under attack. That means if North Korea attacks South Korea or provokes a conflict that results in a South Korean response, Russia is treaty obligated to provide military assistance to Pyongyang. For South Korea, this was a red line crossed in broad daylight. Not a subtle repositioning, not a diplomatic adjustment. A formal military alliance between Russia and the country that has 10,000 artillery pieces aimed at Seoul. South Korea's foreign ministry responded publicly. They warned, in language that diplomatic observers recognized as unusually blunt, that Seoul would reconsider its policy of limiting assistance to Ukraine to non-lethal equipment only. Reconsider. Diplomatic code for the old rules no longer apply. Step 3, October 2024, the final trigger. Western intelligence services and South Korean intelligence confirmed what had been feared for months. Approximately 14,000 North Korean soldiers had been deployed to Russia's Kursk region to fight alongside Russian forces against Ukrainian troops. This was no longer an arms deal. This was no longer a diplomatic partnership. This was a military alliance in active operation. North Korean soldiers fighting in a European war, gaining direct experience in modern industrial warfare, the kind of warfare that involves drones, electronic warfare, precision artillery, satellite reconnaissance, and in exchange for sending their soldiers to die in Russian trenches, North Korea would almost certainly receive advanced Russian military technology, ballistic missile guidance systems, submarine propulsion technology, possibly hypersonic warhead expertise. The Ukraine war had crossed the Sea of Japan. It had arrived on South Korea's doorstep, not as a distant conflict in a foreign land, as a direct threat multiplier for the most dangerous adversary Seoul faces. Every North Korean soldier who survives Ukraine returns to the Korean Peninsula with combat experience. Every technology transfer from Moscow to Pyongyang makes North Korea more capable. Every day, the Russia-DPRK military alliance deepens, Seoul's security environment deteriorates. Putin sent North Korean soldiers to Ukraine to solve a manpower problem, and in doing so, he made South Korea's neutrality untenable. That is the backdrop. That is the chain. That is why, in February 2026, something remarkable is happening. According to diplomatic sources cited by the Korea Times, South Korea is now reviewing whether to join NATO's prioritized Ukraine requirements list, the program known as Pearl. NATO has formally asked Seoul to participate. South Korea's Ministry of Foreign Affairs confirmed it is in continued discussions with NATO on various ways to support Ukraine. The discussions are active, the decision is pending, and the implications are staggering. So what exactly is Pearl, and why does it matter so much? Pearl was launched in July 2025 by the United States and NATO. It was designed to solve a specific problem, a problem that had been getting worse as the war dragged on. With the Trump administration scaling back direct military aid to Ukraine, the burden of keeping Ukrainian defenses supplied fell more heavily on European allies. But procurement was fragmented, slow, politically messy, each country arranging its own separate purchases, its own supply chains, its own timelines, its own political debates about what to send and when. The result was inefficiency at scale. 20 separate procurement pipelines, 20 separate political approval processes, 20 separate delivery schedules. In a war where ammunition expenditure is measured in thousands of rounds per day, that fragmentation was costing lives. Pearl changed the architecture. Instead of 20 separate pipelines, participating countries pool their financial contributions into a single coordinated mechanism. Washington then uses that pooled funding to supply U.S.-made arms and critical military equipment directly to Ukraine. Faster delivery, better coordination, dramatically higher purchasing power. The numbers are extraordinary. As reported by NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte during a visit to Kiev in early February 2026, Pearl has funded approximately 75% of all Patriot missile systems delivered to Ukraine, and 90% of the missiles used in other air defense systems. 75% of Patriot systems through a single coordinated funding mechanism. That is not a supplement to Ukraine's defense. That is Ukraine's defense. Without Pearl, the air defense umbrella that protects Ukrainian cities from Russian missile attacks would collapse. As of December 2025, member states had pledged more than $4 billion to the program. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has stated that roughly $15 billion will be needed through Pearl in 2026 alone. And as of early this year, only $584 million of that had been committed. That gap between $15 billion needed and $584 million committed is enormous, and filling it requires exactly the kind of wealthy, technologically sophisticated partner that South Korea represents. Now, here's where it gets truly interesting, because South Korea's participation would not necessarily mean direct weapons deliveries to Ukraine. Seoul's official position, confirmed by foreign ministry officials, remains focused on humanitarian aid and non-lethal military equipment. And critics, commentators who want to dismiss this as symbolic, as toothless, as gesture politics, point to that limitation and say, see, South Korea isn't really going to change anything. Those critics are missing something fundamental about how defense financing works. And what they're missing is the concept that makes Pearl so strategically powerful. Fungibility. Money has no color in pooled defense financing. Think about it this way. If South Korea contributes $500 million to Pearl, even if every dollar is exclusively earmarked for air defense radars or surveillance systems or body armor, that $500 million frees up an equivalent amount of funding from European NATO members, funding that can be spent on Patriot missiles, on HIMARS rockets, on advanced artillery shells, on the weapons that directly kill Russian soldiers and destroy Russian equipment. South Korea's money, regardless of what it's nominally tagged for, expands the total firepower flowing into Ukraine. Every dollar Seoul contributes for non-lethal equipment is a dollar that a European ally doesn't have to spend on non-lethal equipment and can spend on lethal equipment instead. The fungibility of defense finance means that Seoul's participation, even within the constraints of its official non-lethal policy, dramatically increases the volume of weapons reaching the Ukrainian front line. And that's before you consider the indirect effects. Do Jin-ho, head of the Eurasia Center at the Korea Institute for Defense Analysis, put it directly. Beyond strategic alignment with NATO, joining Pearl could serve as leverage to expand South Korea's defense footprint among NATO members. And that footprint is already formidable, already reshaping the European battlefield, already demonstrating why South Korea's defense industry is the most underappreciated strategic asset in the world. Let me show you what South Korea actually brings to this equation, because this is where the industrial and military reality becomes almost breathtaking. The United States, The world's largest defense contractor, the country that spends more on its military than the next 10 nations combined, currently produces approximately 90,000 155mm artillery shells per year. That is after aggressive production ramp-ups driven by the demands of the Ukraine war, after emergency investments, after expedited contracts, after every acceleration the American defense industrial base could manage, 90,000 per year. South Korea's annual production capacity exceeds 200,000 per year from a country of 51 million people, more than double the American output, from a country with 1/6 the population. This is not a coincidence. It is not luck. It is not a quirk of economics. It is the product of 7 decades of near-continuous deterrence on the Korean Peninsula, 70 years of living under the shadow of a million-man army across the DMZ, 70 years of maintaining a defense industrial base that could sustain high-intensity warfare against a numerically superior enemy. The result is a manufacturing ecosystem that combines German engineering precision with American production scale at a fraction of the cost. A system built not for peacetime efficiency, but for wartime necessity. A system that is, in 2026, exactly what Ukraine needs and exactly what NATO cannot produce fast enough on its own. The flagship products of that ecosystem are weapon systems that are already reshaping the European defense landscape, even before South Korea formally joins Pearl. The K9 Thunder self-propelled howitzer. This is not just a weapon system. It is a masterclass in mobile artillery, a lesson in what happens when a nation spends 7 decades perfecting the art of raining steel on its enemies before they can fire back. While Russian forces struggle with Soviet-era artillery, systems that require multiple soldiers for operation, significant setup time, and suffer from mechanical reliability issues in extreme weather, the K9 achieves millimeter precision with GPS-guided munitions. It fires and repositions in under 60 seconds. It operates effectively in temperatures ranging from -32 to +46 degrees Celsius. It can fire, destroy its target, and disappear before Russian counter-battery radars can even generate a fire mission. In the brutal arithmetic of artillery warfare that defines the eastern Ukrainian front, where survival is measured in seconds between firing and moving, where counter-battery fire kills crews who stay in position too long, where the side with faster shoot-and-scoot capability dominates the exchange, the K9 is not an incremental advantage. It is a generational leap. Then there is the K2 Black Panther main battle tank. Putin loves to display his T-90 tanks on Red Square. State television runs lengthy features on their armor packages, their targeting systems, their intimidating silhouettes rolling past the Kremlin walls, and on a parade ground, they are impressive. But in the mud of eastern Ukraine, against a K2 equipped with active protection systems that intercept incoming anti-tank missiles in flight, a 120mm smoothbore cannon with an autoloader that maintains a firing rate manual load Soviet designs cannot match, a commander-controlled remote weapons station, and a hybrid electric drive that enables near-silent, low-speed maneuvering denying acoustic detection, the propaganda ends and the physics begins. The T-90, for all its parade ground glory, is a product of a different industrial era, an era when sheer numbers compensated for technological inferiority, an era when you could lose 3 tanks to destroy 1 because you had 3 to spare. Russia doesn't have 3 to spare anymore. It's pulling T-62s from storage, tanks designed in the 1960s, and it's facing an opponent that may soon be equipped with K2s designed in the 2020s. South Korea has already delivered hundreds of K9 howitzers to Poland under contracts worth over $12 billion. K2 tanks are in the delivery pipeline. Thousands more are on order. Poland, Norway, Romania, Finland, all actively evaluating additional South Korean systems. The logic is simple. South Korea can deliver what Europe needs. Faster, at better value, at higher quality than many Western competitors, and with production capacity that dwarfs what European defense industries can generate domestically. Here is the domino effect that connects South Korea's defense industry directly to the Ukrainian front line. As South Korea fills Polish warehouses with K2 tanks and K9 howitzers, Poland and other European states can transfer their older but still capable equipment to Ukraine. T-72 tanks. BMP infantry fighting vehicles, Soviet-era artillery systems, equipment that Ukrainian forces are already trained on, equipment that can be deployed immediately without months of retraining. This is not theoretical. This is happening. Polish T-72s are in Ukraine right now because Poland could afford to give them away, because South Korea replaced them. South Korea is, in effect, the industrial backbone that makes Europe's generosity to Ukraine financially and militarily sustainable. Without South Korean production capacity, European allies face a choice: arm Ukraine or maintain their own defense posture. With South Korean production capacity, they can do both. Now add Pearl membership to this picture. Now Seoul is not just an indirect supplier, not just an arms merchant serving European allies who happen to support Ukraine. South Korea becomes formally integrated into NATO's Ukraine support architecture. The industrial backbone becomes a financial pillar. The indirect supplier becomes a direct participant. And you can understand why Moscow is alarmed. The Kremlin's response tells you everything about how seriously Russia is taking this. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova responded immediately when reports of Seoul's Pearl consideration surfaced. She stated that South Korea's participation would cause irreparable damage to relations between Russia and the Republic of Korea, and that Moscow would be forced to exercise its right to retaliate. Irreparable damage, not concern, not disappointment. Irreparable. She went further. Russia was surprised by the reports because South Korea's official line of non-participation in Western arms support had been viewed by Moscow as a prerequisite for the future restoration of relations. That last phrase is worth pausing on. A prerequisite for the future restoration of relations. Russia has been holding out the prospect of post-war diplomatic normalization as a reason for Seoul to stay neutral. The implicit promise: help us now by staying out, and when this is over, we'll reward your restraint with a restored relationship. That leverage, the promise of future normalization, is evaporating. Because Seoul has concluded that the future Moscow is offering isn't worth the cost of the present Moscow is creating. A present where North Korean soldiers gain combat experience in Ukraine, where Russian military technology flows to Pyongyang, where the most dangerous threat on South Korea's border grows more capable by the month. The future restoration of relations isn't worth much when the present destruction of security is accelerating daily. And the TP, asymmetric retaliation, Zakharova hinted at. Let me decode that phrase carefully. Asymmetric. In the language of strategic diplomacy, almost always means we cannot hurt you economically. We cannot match you militarily, but we can cause you problems in ways that don't constitute open conflict. For Russia and South Korea, the only meaningful asymmetric card is North Korea. Moscow could accelerate the transfer of advanced military technology to Pyongyang, ballistic missile guidance systems, submarine propulsion technology, hypersonic warhead expertise, technologies that would dramatically enhance North Korea's ability to threaten South Korea and its allies. But here is Putin's dilemma. That card has enormous costs that constrain Moscow far more than its target. Russia is fighting a war of attrition in Ukraine. It cannot easily spare advanced weapons technology for a client state that contributes soldiers but not resources. More critically, and this is the constraint that limits everything, Beijing does not want a more capable North Korea.